so much, Josephine.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. Okay, I'm going to be really honest. We have one goal for this presentation, and that is that I don't embarrass Dr. Cohick as her student, as her former student. That is my one goal. In her rendition of how I came to be working with her is quite a bit different from the way I remember becoming a student with Dr. Cohick. I was already in a PhD program, and I was listening to the Stone Chapel podcast. I live in Houston, Texas, which is down the street from the Lanier Theological Library, and they put on a podcast, and Dr. David Capes, was chatting with Dr. Cohick on the podcast. I'm in my car, I'm listening to the podcast. I don't even remember what she was talking about. I just remember being fascinated by her topic, her content. So I didn't know her. I didn't know of her project. I don't even really know Dr. Kate. I just was listening in the car, and I sent an email. I looked in the show notes, found her email, just sent her an email. Hey, I would like to know a little bit more. This is how I remember it. I would like to know a little bit more about what you were talking about. That turned into, like, within 2 weeks, I'm enrolled in her seminary program at Northern Seminary. I'm a student in seminary and am knee-deep in content and subject matter that I had never heard of before. So although I hope that I appear very poised and confident, what I'm really doing on the inside is jumping up and down to be able to share with you a story that came out of that time that I spent with Dr. Cohick about a woman that I knew nothing about, and I dare say probably the majority of the people in this room do not, except for maybe Dr. Barr. So let's get started. And I also have to say, when I grow up, don't let the gray hair fool you. When I grow up, I'm going to be Dr. Kalantzis and be able to speak off the fly for an hour about a topic. But I'm not there yet, so I will be sharing a presentation with you about Etheldreda. So I come to this theme as an interdisciplinary scholar, one who is grasping at the storied nature of human beings. And I have to stop right here. Already, I'm going off script. My dissertation and my field of study has nothing to do with history, really, nothing to do with women in Christian, nothing. And yet, there are these fascinating connections. So to put it in a nutshell, here's the easiest way to say my dissertation topic. I am trying to convince pastors to read fiction, particularly detective fiction. So my dissertation is on detective fiction. And I promise you, there's a connection to Etheldreda as 7th century abbess that is going to blow your mind. Okay, let's start over. So I come to this theme as an interdisciplinary scholar who's grasping at the storied nature of human beings and of our singular and extraordinary storied vernacular that somehow reflects the language of God. So my contribution today is to focus on story itself, what it is and what it does, especially for those who are listening for the voice of God. Together, we will look at the way that story is narrated in written prose and in art, of course, to establish that any narrative medium can echo the voice of God. So to do this work, I would like to tell you a story, the story of Etheldreda, Queen of Northumbria, Abbess of Ely. Ethelthryt was a 7th century Christian born to Anna, an Anglo-Saxon king of the East Angles, land that today includes the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire. Ethelthryt is also known by the name Etheldreda, from which we get the name, and perhaps you've heard of St. Audrey. An interesting side note about Etheldreda's name is found in a 19th century etymological dictionary of the English language. The word tawdry is a word that describes worthless, gaudy jewelry, and was first used in the mid-1500s. Did you catch that? We've got a 7th century abbess and we're referring to her in the 1500s, in reference to a necklace made of lace that was sold at St. Audrey's Fair on the Isle of Ely. Ely is going to be a very important geographical location for us. Some scholars doubt the fair's prominence and instead attribute the correlation of the word tawdry to Etheldreda's cause of death, which was that of a swelling in her throat, which, as the story goes, Etheldreda attributed to her preference for fine necklaces in her youth. How many of you are now self-conscious about what you are wearing? You will notice I am not wearing a necklace. Either way, Etheldreda's name lives on, though I would propose that as a namesake, she is forgotten. Etheldreda's father, King Anna, is mentioned in the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history as a good man and happy in a good and saintly offspring. As a result of Anna's devout household, Etheldreda and all three of her sisters aspired to the religious life. But before Etheldreda could take the veil, she was given in marriage, as is done at that time in history, as part of a political alliance. However, Etheldreda's marriage to Tonbert, priest of East Anglia, was in name only, allowing Etheldreda to maintain her vow of chastity. So you'll notice East Anglia is down here in the bottom right-hand section. Ely is here. And so as a wedding gift, Tonbert bestowed Etheldreda the Isle of Ely, though the thoughtfulness of his gift may be questioned, as Ely was basically a swamp. It was a Finland from which the name gets its name, the island of eels. At this point of history, for any of you who've been to England, the fens have been drained. I can't remember what century that was. I'm also not a historian, so this is way out of my wheelhouse. But at this point in history, it's surrounded by water. The island of eels is known as Ely. And after Tonbert's death, Etheldreda retired to Ely to give herself wholly to the religious life. However, with the death of her father, and now the death of Tonbert, her first husband, Etheldreda had to once again make another political match to strengthen her East Anglian kingdom. So Etheldreda married Egfrid of Northumbria. You'll notice that let me get to this map. So here's East Anglia. She's marrying the king of at that time he's prince, I think, of Northumbria. Though a stipulation of the union included the same terms to which Tonbert had agreed, that it would be a marriage in name only. So after the marriage, Etheldreda retired to the abbey at Coldingham to take the veil. But King Egfrid had a change of heart, regretted his decision to allow Etheldreda to enter into the convent. So he set out with an armed escort, determined to take Etheldreda back by force to the Northumbrian court. To escape, Etheldreda set out for her manor at Ely. Here. Giving chase, Egfrid was close to capturing Etheldreda, as the story goes, but for a miracle. Etheldreda sought refuge on a promontory during a fierce storm. Water surrounded the hill, making it impossible for Egfrid to reach her. And after waiting for several days, he gives up, calls off the chase, no longer has any desire to capture her, and Etheldreda continues her flight to Ely. Another miracle that is attributed to this journey, Etheldreda was using a staff to aid her footing on the terrain, and as she laid down to rest, she sticks the staff into the ground where it blossoms with leaf and flower as she slept. Arriving at Ely, and now fully free to live the devoted life that she desired, Etheldreda founded the religious house, which would eventually become the great Benedictine Abbey. So here's a little spoiler alert. This is the cathedral in Ely that was founded in the 700s by Etheldreda. And they have a depiction here of kind of her life, her story in life. She starts out as the princess of East Anglia, becomes a queen, becomes a nun, becomes an abbess. According to an early 20th century history written for the Cambridge Church Congress, the foundation at Ely, and here's where it gets really fun, was a double house of monks and nuns. Each sex had its own straitly guarded enclosure, and all were under the rule of the abbess, Etheldreda. The historical account continues. It is probable that in St. Etheldreda's time, there was no house of nuns which had not attached to it a house of monks. In all double houses, the abbess was supreme, appointing a prior over the monks, and the abbesses were women of great administrative power. Greatest of all was St. Hilda. Perhaps you know of her. There's a really fun connection between St. Hilda and St. Etheldreda that we'll talk about. We're going to be talking about a lot at the end, but who ruled successively over the double houses of Hartlepool and Whitby. Like Hilda, Etheldreda lived a devout life before succumbing to a disease that caused her great pain in the throat, to which Etheldreda is said to have lamented, "I know of a surety that I deservedly bear the weight of my trouble on my neck, for I remember that when I was a young maiden, I bore on it the needless weight of necklaces, and therefore I believe the divine goodness would have me endure the pain in my neck, so that I may be absolved from the guilt of my needless levity, having now, instead of golden pearls, the fiery heat of a tumor rising on my neck." The Venerable Bede recounted her death in his history. She was taken to the Lord in the midst of her flock 7 years after she had been made abbess, and as she had ordered, was buried among them in a wooden coffin in her turn, according to the order in which she had passed away. Upon her death, Etheldreda's sister, Sixburga, took up the office of abbess, and after 16 years, during which Etheldreda's fame grew, the abbess thought to translate her sister's body into the church. So monks from the abbey looked for stone to build a coffin, but finding none, they traveled to Cambridge, where they just happened to find a white marble coffin with a beautifully wrought lid sitting near the city walls. They determined that this was God's provision, so they carried it back to Ely. However, when Etheldreda's grave was opened, her body was found to be uncorrupted, and according to Bede, the attending physician at Etheldreda's death was also present at her translation and was able to attest to the miracle. According to her physician, Sinifred, as they took the veil off Etheldreda's face, he looked at her neck and stated that the incision which I had made was healed up. There's nothing left but the slightest trace of a scar. Etheldreda's influence continued for hundreds of years after her death, and according to Ernest Hermitage, writing for the Cambridge Church Congress, Etheldreda's house grew and prospered ever more and more, increasing in fervor from the regular discipline and order of the monastery until the Viking attacks of the 9th century. I don't like this slide. It is important to note that this prospering momentum was initially supervised by women, as upon Etheldreda's death, the abbey was governed by her sister Sixburga, who was succeeded by Sixburga's daughter and Etheldreda's niece, Ermenhild, and finally by Ermenhild's daughter, Etheldreda's great-niece, Roberga. I actually love this slide. I don't like what happens next, so the story continues. The abbey was restored a century later by Ethelwold, a 10th century leader in the monastic reform movement. But Ethelwold's influence was overshadowed by Etheldreda, who was considered the community's primary saint for most of the medieval period. The cult of Etheldreda continued to grow, as well as her ascribed power, which now included vengeance miracles of protection and control over her cult and lands. A significant ecclesiastical posturing in a post-conquest England. Etheldreda became a crucial church figure, and stories of her life appeared in Middle English, Latin, and French iterations between the 10th and 12th centuries. However, from Ethelwold's 10th century reestablishment onward, the abbey in Ely became a house for men only, even though Etheldreda's original 7th century establishment was principally for women. In her story's revival during this time period, Etheldreda's virginity, a virginity manifested in the continuing presence of her incorrupt body at Ely, provided the monks of the newly established abbey with a tangible symbol. And Jocelyn Wogan Brown states, guardianship of her relics conferred guardianship of her church and land. Etheldreda's virginity was thus highly significant for the monks of Ely, not only as the embodiment of a doctrinal and behavioral ideal with its own powerful, effective, and psychological relevance for a professionally celibate community, but for its divine testimony to intact property rights. Wogan Brown suggests that for the 12th century monks at Ely, Etheldreda's story functioned as an ideal rather than as a biographical role model. One extant copy of Etheldreda's story is found in a 13th century manuscript, which includes the life of St. Audrey. The manuscript contains a collection of Anglo-Norman saints' legends that were to be read at mealtimes in a nunnery in Suffolk. The biography was authored by, we know her name, a woman named Marie, though her identity we do not know. And regardless, Wogan Brown notes that the best reception context is that of a text for reading aloud by women to other women in a female community. That was the purpose of the story. So regardless of their relocation from the Abbey in Ely, women revered Etheldreda as a model of Christian life. What is interesting about this story of Etheldreda, which is Audrey, her Latin name, is that Marie's 13th century translated rendition differs from the Latin history, which was authored by a monk in the 12th century. According to Wogan Brown, Marie follows this Latin source closely for Etheldreda's story, but in a wholly different koine. Where the Liber Aliensis sees Etheldreda's story as an ideal, the life of St. Audrey positions Etheldreda as a female protagonist rather than a type of virginity, which was considered the chief qualification for female sanctity. The inflection of the translation has even more significance in consideration of Etheldreda's dower from her first husband, Tonbert. According to Wogan Brown, now this part I didn't know, so this is really interesting to me. In the Anglo-Norman life, Audrey's dower lands are even more importantly a refuge and a basis for her independent life. On marriage, the property brought by a woman, the dowry, we know that, came under the control of her husband, but provision for her widowhood was made out of his wedding gift to her, the dower. Dower then, to this, or in some cases to part of it, she retained her rights. So dower, not dowry, is thus critical in the context of Anglo-Norman female independence. Legally, it is a part of a married woman's property over which, as a widow, she would expect to have control. That comes into play in just a few minutes. It's really interesting. So Marie's translation suggests that Etheldreda's virginity is a personal, socioeconomic autonomy that allows her to establish a female religious career, while the monks used Etheldreda's virginity as the justification for property rights. So Marie's female protagonist viewpoint suggests freedom of volition. Though Etheldreda does not suffer martyrdom, the favored destiny for the virginal hagiographical heroine, the various renditions of her story hint at a martyrdom without iron. Think back to her explanation of her suffering that caused her death. So Etheldreda's ascetic lifestyle speaks to bodily suffering, and together with her flight to Ely, Wogan Brown suggests that Etheldreda, or Audrey, exemplifies the eremitic and anchoritic spirituality especially prevalent in insular culture, and especially undertaken by women in the 12th and 13th centuries. However, the various renditions of Etheldreda's story in various Anglo-Norman language speaks to a broader female audience, one whose lived experiences span a wide range of life stages. Wogan Brown highlights the various ways that women would move in and out of religious communities as virgins, wives, and widows. Women in each of these stages could find significance in Etheldreda's story. That word, hang on to it, it's going to be real important in a few minutes. Wogan Brown suggests that a female community like the one to which the story of the life of Audrey was written will have included many members whose experiences of marriage and widowhood would have made Audrey's biography resonant hearing. Ultimately, Wogan Brown proposes that Etheldreda's story offered wealthy Anglo-Norman noblewomen, let me say that 3 times, Anglo-Norman noblewomen, a template for autonomy in a society of dynastic marriage, and I'm quoting here because it's beautiful, where one could be disposed of as a piece of property, one repost was to dispose of property one's self. In a system where virginity was exchanged for dower property, the use of a dower property for a life of consecrated virginity forms a suggestive example of the ways in which power could be rerouted. The way that Etheldreda's story was presented in the story of the life of Audrey differs in tone from the way that Etheldreda's story was used for the political religious posturing by Ethelwold in the 10th century. Which edition of the story is correct? Is one false? Is one true? How do we choose which one to believe? I propose that belief in a story occurs when the reader attributes significance to the meaning implied by the author. To support this statement, I would like to focus no longer on Etheldreda, the biographical figure, but rather on Etheldreda, the storied figure. A focus on genre will demonstrate why Etheldreda's story, or the stories of Perpetua, Agatha, Cecilia, and many other women of Christian history, matters for us today as we read the stories in the 21st century. Furthermore, a brief foray into genre will highlight the connection between belief and narrative story, allowing an examination of the symposium thesis that believing her story helps us to listen to the voice of God. Now take a deep breath, because this might be just a little bit boring, but I promise it will be worth it if you will just hang with me till the end, okay? So what is story? In a post-Enlightenment literary framework, Etheldreda's story, like many hagiographical stories, is difficult to believe. According to modern genre, Etheldreda's story would be considered fiction, at best historical fiction, because certain elements of Etheldreda's story cannot be authenticated outside of a religious context. Hagiography, or if I say it in my Texas accent, hagiography, with its roots in the sacred history writings of Eusebius in the 4th century, lacks the unbiased research methodology of a post-Enlightenment era. However, a broader look at story reveals that the truth of the human experience can be revealed in multiple genres of story. Let me say that again. Story reveals that the truth of the human experience can be revealed in multiple genres of story. So a bifurcation of fictional story as false and nonfiction scientific discourse as true is too narrow for considering how story impacts belief. The logos of story and appeal to reason goes beyond genre. Within his proposed paradigm for human communication, Walter Fisher has insight for how to think of story in pre-Aristotelian thought. Logos was a generic term that encompassed all forms of story. And he argues that Aristotle's hierarchical configuration, I don't know why I put so many, say that 3 times. I don't even remember where I was. Hierarchical configuration of discourse paved the way for future thinkers to draw clear distinctions between scientific discourse, which leads to true knowledge, and poetic discourse or stories, which function as an imitation of reality. Fisher posits a paradigm that returns to pre-Aristotelian idea of mythos logos to state that story is the basis of human communication. Fisher is not alone in his position. Alistair MacIntyre states that man is a storytelling animal that becomes, through his history, a teller of stories. And T. Wright also acknowledges the storied nature of human consciousness. Fisher is arguing that mythos logos, fictional story, is constitutive of truth and meaning. In other words, humans logos through storytelling communication. Playing with the word tense in this statement is purposeful, acknowledging the complexity of logos as narrated word and reason and the word. Fisher contends that the Socratic philosophy of Plato and Aristotle caused mythos to be subjugated to logos, and as a result, fiction is considered inferior to scientific discourse that speaks to truth, knowledge, and reality. However, the subjugation of philosophical mythos is incorrect. Mythos is not the antithesis of logos. Logos and mythos are 2 approaches to logos in the divine sense, truth. Fictional mythos is not a lie that is pitted against non-fictional logos. This moves the conversation forward to a discussion of meaning and significance. Okay, but first, this really boring part. Investigating terminology a little bit more deeply so that story is fully elucidated for us. outside of narratology and related disciplines. Terms such as narrative, story, and literature are often used interchangeably. Consensus regarding narrative is difficult because some scholars work to describe narrative function, while others try to describe narrative essence. In his survey of the field, H. Porter Abbott provides a simple definition. Narrative is the representation of an event or series of events. For Abbott, the key word in the definition is event. Without event, there is no narrative. So, when distinguishing between narrative and story, Abbott offers this distinction. Narrative is the representation of events consisting of story and narrative discourse. So story, is an event or sequence of events. It is the action that happens. Narrative discourse is those events as represented. That will be important as we think about later about how it's represented, whether it's in art or architecture or written narrative. But this is what I really want you to catch here. There is a dependent relationship between story and narrative, or as Abbott concludes, we never see a story directly. We always pick up that event through narrative discourse. The story is always mediated. And as Dr. Kalantzis was telling us, that mediation can become very problematic. The story is always mediated by a voice, a style of writing, camera angles, actors' interpretations. I would add here the painter's brush, so that what we call the story is really something that we and the author collaborate in constructing. The author by implication, and we, the reader, by inference. So Abbott's analysis underscores two important implications that I want us to take going forward. First, there's a relationship between the author and the reader. And second, both are active. You as the reader are active in the relationship. The author implies meaning, the reader infers meaning. Story is a relationship. So this very short foray into narrative theory is important to the current discussion because it highlights the difference between the way that Marie narrated Etheldreda's story and the way that Ethelwold told Etheldreda's story. Marie is representing Etheldreda's story with a much different meaning than Ethelwold's representation. Marie represents the story for the purpose of devotion, while Ethelwold and subsequent male leaders represented Etheldreda's story for the purpose of religious posturing against political power. Before moving on from literary theory, I told you we were done. We got one more little point. There is one more crucial point to make about the essence of story. Mark Turner goes further than any scholar I've presented so far to suggest that narrative imagining is the fundamental instrument of thought. It is the way humans reason. Turner continues, human rational capacities depend upon story. It is our chief means of looking into the future, of predicting, of planning, and of explaining. It is a literary capacity indispensable to human cognition generally. Much of what Turner says hints of Paul Ricoeur, but he adds an interesting proviso to literary narrative in his description of a parable. For Turner, parable is a special kind of literature that combines story and projection. Turner says that parable is the root of the human mind, of thinking, knowing, acting, creating, and plausibly even speaking. Aren't we feeling a burning in our hearts that this is how God chose to narrate his story to us? Malcolm Geet provides insight to consider this claim from a scriptural perspective. I think you mentioned Geet in your presentation earlier. Arguing against a materialistic reduction of human beings, Geet affirms the inner light of the human mind as evidence of a creator, logos. To borrow from Turner, projection is a unique human quality that allows a story to stand for something other than its original meaning. The story is projected onto another story for a different significance. We'll get into this a little bit deeper, making it a parable. Geet explains that the fundamental essence of the literary mind, the beautiful, human, imaginative shaping of the way we perceive the world, is itself part of what it means to be made in the image of God. It is indeed the work of the logos within us, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act. Remember our definition of story. the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Humans are storied beings because God is a storied being. He is the eternal event. The why of human narrative discourse is to narrate the truth of the human experience. The truth of the human experience is the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God is the event through which the human story is made possible. Story is the God-created language of humanity. Which brings us to the second question. Now we know what story is, but what does story do? We have touched on story's function. Story is an event that is represented through narrated discourse. Furthermore, this event has meaning for the author. Meaning is the significance, purpose, or underlying truth of something. However, in this relationship between the author and the reader, there is a difference between meaning and significance. Here we get to the root of the matter. E.D. Hirsch distinguishes between meaning and significance in this way. Meaning is that which is represented by a text. It is what the author meant by his use or her use of a particular sign sequence. It is what the signs represent. Significance, on the other hand, names a relationship between that meaning and a person, the reader, or a conception or a situation or anything imaginable. So the distinction of meaning as the purpose or underlying truth and significance as an appropriation of that purpose or truth allows story to exist in a relationship between the author and the reader, a relationship that shares the power of meaning. Abbott would agree. The author's function is implication of meaning. The reader's function is inference or of significance. So in other words, story is a collaborative relationship between persons that results in meaning and significance. Story holds meaning. And in the story relationship, the author invites the reader to give that meaning significance. I think we're going to skip this part, although maybe we shouldn't. So when we know, so Roland Barthes, I don't know if you know this literary person, but the Birth says he's arguing for ignoring the author and any possible meaning behind the text. We should ignore that. It only means what you want it to mean. The story only means what you want it to mean. So he writes that the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. I'm suggesting that by giving this a different significance as the reader, I can say that that statement means the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author, the Logos. So a holistic view of both the author and the reader as agents of meaning and significance allows both persons to grow in understanding and even change their perspectives without negating the meaning of their previous understanding. The language theorist Charles Taylor discusses various ways that story creates meaning. And though Taylor researches the constitutive power of language, story as a particular facet of language warrants his attention. Taylor defines story as this: the telling of people and events in their complex relations, bound as they are inside a narrative. I promise you'll go, oh, that's what she meant. Just a second. We're almost there. The fiction novel, or let's put here, hagiographical story, offers a non-assertive portrayal of life, and as such, can open new horizons for the reader. Taylor's claim of story is important. So my plea here is to see that the telling of stories in fact and fiction as a creative or constitutive feature of language. This statement resonates with the claim that story is an essential element of humanity that is made in the image of God. Taylor continues, this constitutive power is of the greatest importance because it is through story that we make sense of our lives. Making sense of life is discovering meaning. Both Ricker and Taylor argue that the human ability to make and understand story affords an understanding of the self. For Ricker, there is an interplay of meaning between the author and the reader. The imagination at play in the author's world is the self conferred by the work, recognizing a presented essence, the meaning of the text. Ricker is speaking specifically about fictional story, which may be used to support the value of hagiography. Meaning eclipses veracity. The event or the person as event is important, but not as important as the meaning of that event or the life of that person and the significance that I, as the 21st century reader, give it. So, story suggests distantiation. If you're unfamiliar with this term, Ricker further describes the process, which is that a reader exists in a space in front of the work. For what must be interpreted in a text is a proposed world which I could inhabit and wherein I could project my own most possibilities. Ricker continues, through fiction and poetry, new possibilities of being in the world are opened up within our everyday reality. Stories intend being, not under the modality of being given, but under the modality of power to be. So listen to this part. In other words, stories invite the reader to consider what you would do in the scenario. Would you be as willing as Mary, as brave as Felicitas, as astute as Etheldreda, as missional as Bertha? That is your space in front of the work. One more important function of stories is that they provide an interior look. According to Taylor, stories tell the causes, character, and values of the human condition, as well as the motivation, actions, and interactions of human attitude. The way the reader conceives of what she would do is by a comparative look at why a character acted in such a way. Remember the prior conversation about meaning and significance? This interior look allows us to look past the action to determine significance. We cannot always emulate the actions of our exemplars, nor should we feel the shame for our inability to do so. Stories are not prescriptive of normative behavior, they are descriptive. We do not look to the virgin martyr stories to necessarily emulate their virginity or their martyrdom. We look to their stories to reflect on their motivation for these actions, a motivation that we can and should emulate. The stories of Christian women in history invite us to determine significance that can motivate our actions in the space of in front of the work, the way that we will potentially interact in our current cultural context. Andrew Jacobs discusses the power of these stories in his research of the life of the ascetic. The rhetorical force of these narratives of female renunciation can potentially shape the discursive worlds of future readers and auditors of such stories, reconstruct their worldview, and so transform rhetoric into a new reality. Stories transform the future. So the final question is, how does story resound the voice of God? The symposium theme for this year suggests that we can learn to listen to God by believing the stories of women. In conclusion, I would like to consider the question in light of Etheldreda's story. How does Etheldreda's story resound the voice of God? Story is the God-created language of humanity. Humanity does not all use the same dialect, but every culture at every point in history communicates in the form of story. So when we read or tell stories, we are communicating in a vernacular that in some way images God. Story is an event that is narrated through discourse in a variety of mediums. With the parabolic nature of story in mind, the way that story is projected onto another story to invite new significance, every story can be traced back to the meaning of life. Ultimately, story can be traced to the Logos at the genesis of human existence. Once upon a time is a marker for a human understanding of time, and it is synonymous with in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Stories hold meaning and invite significance. They are a relationship between author and reader, artist and viewer. There is room for caution regarding unhealthy author relationships intimated in the way that Etheldreda's story and Dr. Calantz's presentation intimated in the way that Etheldreda's story and the stories of other women in history have often been co-opted by authors seeking political or social gain. Regardless, stories are relationships, and in this way resound the voice of God, who created us to be in community. Stories provide an interior look and have the power to transform the future by transforming the reader. As we hear the stories of Christian women and explore the interior emotions that motivated their actions, we hear the voice of Jesus saying, "If anyone wants to come with me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." So make no mistake, there were women in that group in Caesarea Philippi. Throughout history, there have been women disciples. We can name them. Dr. Barb will name them for us later, who have taken up their cross. Believe their story.